In this video, I'm going to walk you through importing and appending data using VBA into an Excel table. So this is for when you have a transaction table where you have several months worth, and then you have dashboards and stuff built off of that table, and you get month after month, and then your next month comes in, you need to import it. And then say you have 3 or 4 different exports from different entities and stuff that all different columns. This can help with that. This will help you write an import button that you just select the file and import it and append it to the table. And it's a 4-step process to actually do this. The first step is to select the data file. That's going to be the export file from the bank or wherever you get the transactions from. Then the next one is going to be opening that file and extracting the data from it. And then third, you're going to edit that data. Now that's where you either have to, if you have to multiply a number, if you have to change the columns, something like that. Edit it as you need in memory. And then 4 is take your current table, go to the next row, and then append the new data to that table. So for this example, I have this dashboard here that has a couple charts and pivot tables that are all tied together that are based on this data tab that has several transactions going back years worth of transactions. Well, the way transactions work, you get more months as the months go by. So I'm going to need to open those exports from the bank, etc., and append the data here. I'm going to go over to the developer tab. I'm going to go to Visual Basic, and now I'm going to create my project, start my macros. So the first thing I'm going to do is insert a module. And here I'm going to give the module a name just so I can distinguish it. I'm going to call it the import module. And I also like to rename the code name of the sheets to what they are, to their names or something, so I can reference it. The name that's in parentheses is what the tab is down here. But the code name is something that's not tied to that. But if you set the code name, you can reference the code name and use the Visual Basic IntelliSense to actually suggest some things. So I'm going to rename those, and now I have my project ready. Now I'm going to go ahead and start the macro. So first thing, I'm just going to call it sub import CSV, because I'm assuming that this file from the bank is a CSV file. Well, the first thing I got to do is I have to get the file name. So I'm just going to say S file, which is just a new variable. And I'm going to store the application.getOpen file name. And then I'm going to set file filter. I'm just going to say all files. And it's just an asterisk, which just means it's every file extension. Filter index is going to be 1 because I can set multiple file filters here, and I can set it, hey, go to the second one. But I'm going to say the first one. The title, I'm going to say select export file. And then the button text, I'm going to leave that as just default, which will be open. And then multi-select, I'm going to set it as false because it's going to be one file at a time. If you wanted to set multiple files, you could set that to true and then adjust the macro accordingly. But for this, I'm just going to set it as false. Now that so that's going to open the open file dialog box and get a file name. So, but now I have to make sure that the user didn't cancel out. So I'm going to say if my variable equals false, then exit sub. So that's going to cancel out if the user clicks false. It's going to continue on with the file path in that S file variable if the user clicks open. So that's where the user selects the file. So the next thing I got to do is actually open the file. But you could run into a debug error if you try to open a file that's already open. So I'm going to write code that'll handle that. It's going to check if the file's open, and if it is, use it. But if it's not, then open it. So I'm going to create myself an object of a workbook. And you don't have to declare your variables in Visual Basic. Visual Basic is a loosely typed language. And so if you don't declare your variables, you don't necessarily get the IntelliSense. But if you do declare them, as I do here, I'll be able to say, oh, book. And then if I hit the period, it'll actually suggest things. So that's the benefit of declaring them, but it's not a requirement. So I'm going to say, so I have my workbook. And now I'm going to turn on error handling, because what I'm going to do is try to open or set it as that workbook. Equals workbooks, and then it's going to pull that S file. And the reason I set, and I'm actually going to, before I do that, I'm going to clear out any error that's there, because in just in case there's some random error. So I'm going to reset the error to essentially 0, and then I'm going to set the workbook as that. And if it's open, this will succeed no problem. If it's not open, I need to open the workbook. And so the way to check that is if error.number is not 0, then that's where I'm going to have to go and actually open it. And so I'm going to do application.workbooks.open, and then I'm going to pass in that file name. And also, since I want to know if I need to close that workbook, so if it's already open, I'm not going to close it. But if Visual Basic is going to open the file, I need Visual Basic to close it after I'm done with everything. So I'm going to set that to false by default. And then if it errors out, I'm going to set a Boolean variable to true. So that way, if it errors out, I know that I need to open the workbook. And then once I'm get the data out of it, I'm going to close it. So that actually sets the workbook. That is going to open the workbook. Now I need to actually get the data from that workbook. And I like to do that through a variant called vdata. It can be any name you want, but I use vdata for variant of the data. And so that's going to be book.sheets, and CSV files are always in the first tab. And so I'm just going to use the index of 1 here, which is always just the first tab. If you use an Excel file and it might be on the second tab, you should do sheets 2. But for a CSV file, I'm going to say it's always sheet 1. I'm going to say sales.current region.value. And so what that does is it'll put the current region, which is typically on a CSV file, it's the whole data. I mean, you could miss something if there's a skip in the data, some skipped rows or things like that. But for the most part, sales.currentregion.value is going to get you all of the data on that sheet. Now, and that stores it in memory. So once it's in memory, I don't need that workbook anymore. So I'm going to see if I need to close it. And I'm going to say if it's closed, then book.close, and I'm not going to save changes because VBA opened it, VBA closes it, but VBA is just reading it from it. So if there was any changes made to it, do not save them. So now that workbook is closed if I need it, but and again, if it was already open, it's going to leave it open. But now I'm actually done with that workbook. And the vdata put all the information from that workbook into memory. So it's kind of like copying, but it's more like extracting it than copying it, because copying it would put it in cut copy mode, and then you're stuck in the rigid format that it's in. But for this example, I just want to extract it and put it in memory, and then I get to play with it and manipulate it and make it work for my table. And this is where I can actually edit the data. I can adjust it, ignore columns, whatever I want to do to it. Oops, and I forgot up here, I need to actually set my variable to this workbook that's open. That way, when I reference it right here, I don't get a debug error. And so now I'm going to store the data, or create a variable where I'm going to store my data that I pull from. Variant j equals 0. And so what this is, I call it vrep, which is variant for report. And I set it as a variant so you can have any data type that you want in there. So if you set it a string, it has to be a string, dates have to be dates and stuff. So variant allows you to put anything in there. And so what I've said is 1 to 100,000. That dimension just tells me I have 100,000 rows, and 1 to 5 is 5 columns. And so you could just think of this as a blank Excel spreadsheet that's just in memory of this grid, 100,000 rows and 5 columns, and it's completely blank, ready for me to put stuff into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is start my loop for I equals 2 to ubound v data 1, and set the next. And so I is going to be the index, which is going to be the row number, and v data U bound of V data is the upper bound of V data. So when I copied the data, it has the upper bound is how many rows it has. So like if you're using a range, it's going to have two dimensions. The first dimension is rows, the second dimension is columns. Now, if you're declaring your own, you can actually have three or four, as many dimensions as you need. But a range, if you're actually pulling from a range, it's only going to have two dimensions. And so the upper bound of this first dimension is the amount of rows. Upper bound, if I put 2 here, is going to be the amount of columns. And so this is going to be a one-to-one because, and this is probably very common, is where you actually create your table in the workbook to match whatever bank export it is. But say maybe the bank changes it or something, you might need to change it later on. But for this first one, I'm going to just do it as a one for one. So every column that's in row that's in the export is going to be the exact match column over here. A is A, B is B, etc. So I'm going to say equals V data I1, because J is going to be for the report, I is going to be for the data that you're trying to copy. So I'm going to say it's for 5 columns, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just to show you why it's that way, because if I open and export, you'll see that these 5 columns actually match up perfectly to these 5 columns. And I'll do an example later of when you actually need to manipulate the data. But for this first example, I'm just doing straight up one-to-one copy. So the next thing I got to do is actually paste the data now that I've got it. So this gets the data. Now I'm going to paste it. And I always set if j equals 0 or greater than 0. And I'm going to go ahead and set up my what happens if there's no data. No rows were imported. In VB exclamation, no data. So that's what happens because if it's j is greater than 0, we know we ran this at least once. If j is still 0, then it never even ran and you have no data. And the reason I do this is because sometimes maybe this file was incorrect or corrupted or something and it didn't grab any data. And so you're not going to try to paste anything if you never got any data. And in fact, you'll get an error because if you try to paste essentially 0 data, it's not going to work. Okay, so now I've checked to make sure I've got data. And now I'm going to pull the actual table range. And I'm going to use IntelliSense, so I'm going to declare my variable here. And I'm going to say, let's go and find the data. So if I go out here and go to table design, I know I named this table data. That makes it easy to reference in Visual Basic. But I'm going to actually cycle through some of the list objects. So I'm also going to create a list object variable so I can use its IntelliSense. And also, so now that I've got this, I'm going to say for each LO in data.list objects. And as you can see, that's why I use the code here, the code name data. As soon as I hit the dot after data, it knew I was talking about this sheet. And so list objects is a property of a worksheet. And LO, it knows that is my list object. So I'm going to say next. And then I'm going to say if LO.name equals table data, then set O range equals LO.range. So it's going to go through all the list objects, which a table is a list object. And if that list object is named as table data, I'm going to pull that range. And so it's going to go through that. And I can even set this to, I'm going to exit the for loop after I find it. That way I'm just not wasting any more time in case there's other list objects, like a chart would be a list object and things like that. So Now I'm going to make sure I actually got a range, because if this for each loop ran and didn't find anything, that O range is going to be an undefined variable. So I'm going to make sure O range has something. It's nothing. Then, so I'm going to say if O range is something, essentially, not is nothing is essentially saying it is something. So I have actually created something. And then again, if it's not, I'm going to go ahead and give you a message box saying could not find table, VBA exclamation, uh, table error. I'll just say table error is the title. And go back up here. So now that I've got my table range, I'm going to need to find, and so the table range is going to be A1 to E8504 over here. I need to find where I'm going to paste the data. So I'm going to need to offset all this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a start variable, which is going to pull the address of where I'm going to start pasting my data. And this is going to be offset o range.rows.count. And I'm going to stay in the same column. Dot cells 1 dot. So what that is going to do is going to take my range, which is A1 to E8505. It's going to offset it by the amount of rows in that range. So there's 8,504 rows. So it's going to offset starting in 1 plus 8,504, which will put me right here in cell A8505. I'm not going to offset any columns because I want to start in the first column. And then that's going to offset it, but it's also going to include the total amount of rows in there. So technically that range is still going to be that. So that's where I'm going to actually specify cells, give me index row 1, column 1 of that whole range. And just so that going to give me that first cell only. So next thing I'm going to do is find the end cell. And so I'm going to say send data dot range, and again using the code name of the thing of the sheet, range at start dot offset j4 dot address. And so what that does is from my sheet, I'm going to take range A8505 because I found that up here. I'm going to offset it by the j, which is the amount of rows in the export. And I'm going to offset it by 4 columns because you're already in column 1. So I'm going to offset 1, 2, 3, 4. So plus the rows, that's going to make it, the end cell is going to be like right here, or how many ever rows it is. So now I have the end. I'm going to actually paste my data. Data.range. And then I'm going to say start. And I'm going to put the colon in there. And I'm going to say send.value equals vrep. And so I put the colon in there because if you're like this, what you're seeing is AA5 and colon E8510. That's the actual total address of that whole selection. And so that's what that's doing. It's taking that whole selection. The value of that selection is my report variant. And so my report variant is going to be total, and it's only going to be the rows that this range can entail. So if this range is only 30 rows, even though I declared my report variant as 100,000 rows, it knows that this range is only going to take 30 rows of it. And so it's only going to take the first 30 rows of this. But this should always match to how many. That's why you use J to find it, just so you know the exact amount of rows. So let's give this a test. If I hit F5, it's going to pull it up. I'm going to say run it, and you saw it flashed, and now you can see I imported May. All the data is here. It's good to go. So now comes the fact that what happens when you have different types of files and exports. And let's just say I'm over here, I have from a different bank. I have, they put stuff in a different column, and this is negative, and so like things are completely different. Well, and if you're doing this manually, you have to move the columns over and do a whole different column of finding the absolute value, or just multiply this by -1, and then you can paste it over. Well, let's do it in a macro. And for this, I'll go ahead and close it. here, go back into my macro. And so for this, I'm going to set up two. So I'm going to say import, let's say the first one was JP Morgan. I'm going to say that, and I'm going to say call import CSV, and I'm going to say JP. And now I'm going to come down here and put a parameter that says import by val, import type as string. And so now I'm going to pass that in there. So now, right now, it's going to run the exact same as it did before. And so because I put the parameter in here, but I haven't set anything to actually change based on that parameter. And so for this, I'm going to copy it. I'm going to make another one. I'm going to call this one Chase. And I just use all lowercase just to make sure you don't mess up or something. Staying all lowercase when you're dealing with parameters makes things easier. And pretty much everything can stay the same, but right here is where you're going to change things. This is where you're going to change based on the type of file that you're getting. So for this, I'm going to say if import type equals, and let's say JP, then, well, we already know that this one is good. So I'm not even going to mess with this one. I'm just going to, and I'm going to say else if import type equals chase, then and if, and I'm going to tab these out just so it's easier to read. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste. And now this is where I'm going to make some changes. So I'm going to leave vrep 1, 2, 3, 4 because I want to paste it in the same and it's easier to read that way. But the columns are going to be different. And so let me go open that file again. So I know the posted date is in column A, so that's actually the same. So the date is in the same. Amount, though, which I have in column 5, is actually in column 2 here. So I'm going to come over here and say what I want in column 5 is actually in column 2. And I actually see that it's negative 2. So I'm going to have to multiply it by -1. And now, so the next thing, so I want transaction number in my second column. Well, that's going to be right here in column C. So I go back here. So my transaction number actually comes from 3. And next, description and category are payee and category. So I know that those are 4 and 5. So I'm making my manipulations. And it's that simple. Now this is all ready to go. And I can run this one to import the JP Morgan. I can run this one to import the Chase. And so let's close that. And I think I had an extra row in this file when I was playing with it, so it showed up there. But so now if I go back here, I say import chase file. I pull August CSV. It's going to run through it. And it imported everything. It multiplied this by -1. It pulled the reference number. It's all good to go. No problems. All right, so that's a quick way to import data, and you could set up 100 different imports for all the different things. This is very useful when you're dealing with transactions, because now I can come back over to my summary tab, and now I have a macro to do that every single month. And so now that I have the data here, I can come here, right click, refresh. I think everything already refreshed. And now I have all my latest months in here. And so this is very useful for transactional data, just to get all your months, and you can have all different types of exports and append them all in one quick button.